Hi, everyone. I'm slightly concerned. There's only 22 people here. Class is 48, which means I'm somewhat concerned I might have lost about half of you after that first exam. I hope my exam was not that difficult. Hopefully more people will be joining us. I have one announcement to make just before we get started. I always forget to mention this, but whenever I upload my syllabus to Canvas, for some reason, Canvas seems to mess up the formatting. And so when it messes up the formatting, the course calendar dates sometimes get off track for some people if you've downloaded the syllabus directly from Canvas. So just to make sure we're on the same page, let's just verify that we're all working with the same dates. Here's the actual syllabus. Just verify that you have the correct exam dates here. So exam 2 is March 2nd. Exam 3 is March 25th. And the final exam is April 20th. Okay. If you have different dates than that in the version of the syllabus that you have, then it's probably an issue with Canvas messing up the formatting. Don't go with that. Okay. These are the correct dates here. So that's going to be March 2nd for exam 2, March 25th for exam 3, April 20th for the final exam. Okay. We didn't get a chance to finish the section on the self, so I want to do that now. We have a few more slides left in that section. So I want to take about 10 or 15 minutes to finish up the slides, and then we'll go on off and start talking about a new topic with that. So of course, we were talking about the self, and in particular, we were still talking about the affective component to the self, which is how we feel about ourselves. And the general theme from that section, and something that's going to pop up again in multiple lectures in the future, was that we tend to think really highly of ourselves. We tend to like ourselves a lot, and we have all sorts of psychological mechanisms that we use to maintain really high self-esteem. And that brings up an important question, which is whether these sorts of positive illusions that we have about ourselves are a good thing or a bad thing. And a lot of standard ideas about mental health, historically in psychology, have relied on this idea that the mentally healthy person is the person who sees themselves most accurately. And so according to those general ideas, those models of mental health, these positive illusions would be a bad thing because they keep us from seeing ourselves as we actually are, which would be a hallmark of good mental health. But in the 1980s, a woman by the name of Shelley Taylor, who is a social psychologist, she wrote a really, really influential paper, which basically argued the opposite. She argued that, in fact, the positive illusions that we tend to have, especially in these more Western cultures, are actually a sign of mental health. And mental well-being. They're actually maybe a good thing. I mean, there are some bad aspects to them, and we'll talk about some of those in a second, but they tend to be a sign of actual mental well-being. And she gives a few pieces of evidence in support of this idea. She mentions that there is one group of people within Western culture that do not have these sorts of illusions, these positive illusions that the rest of us have. And those are people who are clinically depressed. Clinically depressed people don't have the same positive illusions that the rest of us have, which is kind of the opposite of what you'd expect if an accurate view of yourself was necessary for mental health, right? You'd expect that the most mentally healthy people would be the people who have the most accurate views of themselves. In fact, it seems to be the opposite. Okay, so depressed people see themselves more accurately, in other words, than non-depressed people. There's a bunch of other pieces of evidence as well that are consistent with this general thesis, and I'll just talk about a couple. One of them is that if you look at people in dating or romantic relationships in general, people who have positive illusions about their partners, who think their partners are actually better than they really are, tend to be happier in the relationship. Again, this is sort of maybe a little bit counterintuitive, because a lot of the times, if we think about why are we with the partner that we're with, people will say things, well, they see me for who I really am. What this data says is, well, let's hope they don't see you for who you really are, really. Let's hope they have positive illusions about you, because they tend to be happier in the relationship if they put you on a pedestal and have all these positive illusions about you than if they don't. And there's probably a sense, if you think about it, in which we sort of know this, if at the beginning of a relationship, when you're really, really into the person, they can do no wrong, and you love everything about that person, right? And then as you get to know them and you're with them for longer and longer periods of time, you start noticing all their flaws, and maybe a year or two down the road, they start doing things that kind of annoy you that didn't annoy you at the beginning. What's happened is that at the very beginning of the relationship, you had all these positive illusions about your partner and you were really happy in the relationship. And as those positive illusions break down, we sometimes get less happy in those relationships. So again, it sort of shows that these positive illusions can be a good thing in terms of the relationships we have. Shelley Taylor also pointed out that there's another illusion which we haven't really talked about in this class, something called the illusion of control. And this is the belief that we can control events that are in fact uncontrollable. And so we see this a lot in terms of things like superstitions that people have, or maybe you have like a lucky pair of socks that you wear every time you take a test. That's the idea that you're trying to control something via, wearing those socks or using your superstitions or whatever it is that you may not be able to control. And again, this is sort of a hallmark of people who seem to be mentally healthy, is that they have this illusion of control. And again, what we see is that depressed people, people with low self-esteem, don't tend to have that illusion of control that the rest of us tend to have. So in other words, what her main thesis is that these illusions that we have are not necessarily a bad thing. They actually help us to function. They help us to have relationships, and they help us to feel good about ourselves. So she might argue that these positive illusions are good for us, or at least have some beneficial aspects to them. But they're not purely good. There are some negative aspects about having these positive illusions as well. First off is that although we all tend to think we're better than we really are in some dimensions, if you go too far, that comes across as really arrogant by others. In other words, people with these inflated self-views who have really, really high self-views of themselves that they can't justify aren't really rated positively by other people. And so if any of you are fans of the show The Office, for instance, the main character, Michael Scott, in that show has these really inflated self-views. And that's where a lot of the comedy from the show comes from, is that his lack of self-awareness, that he can't meet those self-views that he has, that he's not as good as he thinks he is. He's not as good a boss or whatever as he thinks he is. People kind of are uncomfortable around that. They kind of don't necessarily like that he's got those inflated self-views. They might come across as arrogant as a consequence. Furthermore, we know that people with inflated self-views, and this is something I kind of alluded to briefly at the beginning of the semester, people who have this sort of unjustifiably high self-esteem tend to be more aggressive than people who have low self-esteem. So it's generally the case that depressed people aren't very aggressive against others, but people with really high self-esteem are much more aggressive against others. And that's especially the case when people have inflated self-views. In other words, they believe things about themselves that they can't really justify. And the idea is that if someone comes along and insults them or questions those views, in other words, the person who's sort of narcissistic or has these really high self-views, their ego has been threatened, in other words, by this person. Instead of taking that sort of criticism or feedback, they want to and that would force them to drop their self-esteem, which they don't want to do. They want to keep their self-esteem high. So what they'll often do is lash out against the person that insulted them. In that way, they can maintain that unrealistically high self-esteem. So it turns out that having really high self-esteem is associated with a greater likelihood of being aggressive. So obviously, there are some negative consequences having these positive self-views. Okay, so we have talked in this class then about the cognitive component of the self, which is how we come to know ourselves. We just finished talking about the affective component of the self, how we feel about ourselves. We have not yet talked about the behavioral aspect of the self, and I want to spend just a few minutes doing that right now. The behavioral aspect of the self refers to how we present ourselves to other people. Because it turns out that for most people, they behave differently depending on the social context that they find themselves in. And that's probably true of you as well. You probably behave very differently around, let's say, your parents versus around your friends versus when you're at work or at school. Right? We present a different aspect of ourselves to different people. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about the behavioral aspect of the self, how we present ourselves to other people. It's certainly the case that we care about what people think about us. So if we think about just in terms of our physical appearance, we've got multi-billion-dollar industries in terms of things like plastic surgery or Botox or teeth whitening strips or whatever it is, right? People spend a lot of money to sort of change their appearance to sort of shape how they come across to other people. Okay, so we care about how we come across to other people. So the question is, do we actually pay attention to it? In other words, do we monitor a given situation to figure out how we're coming across to other people? And I would argue that not only do we monitor the situation, but we tend to be overly sensitive to how we're coming across to other people. In other words, we tend to think people notice us much more than they actually do. And that's exemplified by a phenomenon known as the spotlight effect. Here's the basic idea behind the spotlight effect. Okay. We monitor how we're coming across to other people so much that we have a tendency to think that people notice us when in fact they don't. Or in other words, we tend to overestimate how much attention other people pay to us. So maybe, for instance, and this often comes out when, let's say you're having a bad hair day, or you woke up and you had a zit on your nose, or there's something that's a little bit off. And to you, it feels as if everyone notices, because everyone can tell you're having a bad hair day, or you have a zit, or whatever it is, right? But in fact, other people don't notice us nearly as much as we think they do. And part of the reason for that is because those other people are concerned about how they're coming across to others as well. So you can kind of think that everyone's in their own bubble. Everyone's kind of concerned about how they're coming across to others. And because they're so concerned about that, we're not really noticing other people as much as we think they do. So let me describe to you a study that looked at this. So what these researchers did, who wanted to look at the spotlight effect, is they took college students and they brought them into a lab and they told them that in a moment, they were going to be interacting with a group of other college students, just like a 10 or 15-minute interaction. Okay, now they're not there, they're down the hall. And but before they go interact with those people, what they had to do was put on a t-shirt with a giant picture of Barry Manilow. In case you don't know who Barry Manilow is, that's Barry Manilow right there. He's a singer. And for most college students, it's kind of a little cheesy to have a picture of Barry Manilow, a giant picture of him on front of your shirt. So these people are kind of self-conscious. So these participants put on a shirt with Barry Manilow on it. They go into another room and they have this interaction with 4 other people. After about 10 or 15 minutes, they leave that room, they come back to the main room, and the experimenter asks them, okay, so of the people that you just interacted with, how many of them do you think noticed your shirt, who was on your shirt? And so the participant gives an estimate between 0 and 4. The researcher then goes into the group of 4 people and asks them the same question. How many of you noticed who was on the participant's shirt? And so what they can do is they can compare participants' estimates of how many people they think noticed them with the actual number of how many people actually noticed them. And when they do this comparison, what they find is that people tend to think that something like twice as many people notice them than actually notice them. And that's the spotlight effect. And it's called the spotlight effect because it feels sometimes like we're in a giant spotlight. It feels like everyone can notice the flaws that we're dealing with on any given day, when in fact, we're drastically overestimating how many other people are actually noticing us. But because of this tendency we have to monitor how we're coming across to others, we will often change our behavior in some ways fairly drastically, depending on the situation we find ourselves in order to shape what people think about us. And the strategies that we use to shape how people think about us, those are called self-presentation strategies. In other words, how we're presenting the self, hence the name self-presentation. There are, or I should say there's one general overarching motivation behind self-presentation that almost everybody engages in, something called strategic self-presentation. And what strategic self-presentation refers to is the idea that we want to come across as in positive ways to other people. So just like we think positively of ourselves, we also want other people to think positively of us as well. And this is sort of obvious, I think. We like it when other people think that we're smart or attractive or generous or whatever positive quality that you can think of. We like it when other people think those positive things about us. And so we'll often engage in ways to try to get those people to think positively of us. So that's why when you succeed at something, if you're a really good violin player or basketball player, you have some sort of skill, You like other people to know about that skill because that way they'll think positively of you. On the other hand, if you fail at something, um, we don't like other people to know that, right? Because then they might think negatively of us. So we're strategic in how we self-present, in that we generally try to put forth the aspects of us that get other people to think positively of us. So when you go on a job interview, for instance, you're not going to act the same way that you act with your friends because you want your friends to think you're fun, right? So you present a fun aspect of yourself to your friends. But you want your job, the person interviewing you, not to think that you're fun. You want them to think that you're competent, right? And so you act differently in a job interview, hopefully, than you do around your friends because we're trying to emphasize different aspects of what those people think about us. So almost everybody in some form or another engages in some degree of strategic self-presentation. But there is a second type of self-presentation, which is a little bit more debatable, I guess, among researchers as to whether or the extent to which people engage in this self-presentation strategy. But I'll mention it. It's something called self-verification. Okay, now the idea here is that if we're engaged in a self-verification motive, then what that means is that whatever we think about ourselves, we want other people to think the same thing that we think about ourselves. So if I think that I'm a very competent person, self-verification means I want other people to think I'm competent as well. On the other hand, if I think I'm not very competent at some task, self-verification would mean I also want other people to think I'm not very competent at that task. So in other words, according to the self-verification motive, we want other people's perceptions of us to match our own perceptions of ourselves. Now, the thing is, most of the time, these two motivations overlap because most of the time we like thinking of ourselves positively. And so what that means is that according to strategic self-presentation, we also want people to see us positively. And according to self-verification, we want people to see us as we see ourselves. So if we see ourselves positively, we want other people to see ourselves positively as well. So most of the time they overlap, but there are some conditions in which they don't overlap. And I'll give you just one quick example here. This is a study where people were categorized based on their responses to some questionnaires as being either submissive or dominant. Okay. They then interacted with a new person that they'd never met before for 15 minutes or so, and then were separated into different rooms. And the researcher went into each room one at a time and said either they're randomly assigned to be told that either their partner thought that they were dominant or their partner thought that they were submissive. Now, that's not true, okay? The researcher is just telling the participant what their partner supposedly thought of them, but it's all just made up. It's all randomly assigned, right? But what that means is that there are some people in the study who are actually dominant, but who are told their partner thinks they're submissive. Now, after that they're told this, they interact with that person again. And if they were a dominant person and they were told their partner thought they were submissive, then the researchers saw that they behaved even more dominantly in that next interaction. In other words, it was as if they were trying to correct the misperception of their partner. On the other hand, if these people were in actual fact submissive and they were told their partner thought they were dominant, then the next time they interacted with their partner, they behaved even more submissively. Again, to try to correct the incorrect view their partner supposedly had of them. So that study is showing that when we think people misperceive us, we try to correct them because we want to be seen in the same way that we see ourselves. Now, there are a lot of benefits of engaging in self-presentation. So you're much more likely to get a job if you emphasize the competent aspect of you and you downplay maybe the wild aspect of you that you might have with your friends. So there are some good aspects. There's good reasons why we engage in self-presentation. There are also problems with self-presentation, though, as well, that we should discuss very quickly. Because self-presenting too much can backfire. In other words, even though we all sort of change who we are a little bit depending on the situation, if it's too obvious that you're doing it, people don't like that. And we have a lot of sort of colorful terms for people who are obviously just sucking up to someone, for instance, like brown nosers, right? we tend not to like it when people are obviously being fake around other people, even though we all kind of do it to some extent or another. So we also sort of know this, that it can backfire, right? So what this usually means is that when we self-present to other people, we kind of exaggerate ourselves a little bit, but not too much, because if it's too much, we know that we can be found out, right? So we all kind of exaggerate ourselves just a little bit. This is partly why, I mean, if you still use Facebook, the pictures that you post on Facebook are always going to be the best photos that you've taken of yourself. It's always going to be the photos of you doing things that are really fun. You're not just taking random photos of yourself in your pajamas on the couch, right? And the reason for that, again, is because you're self-presenting in terms of the photos that you're choosing to share on Facebook or Instagram or whatever it is, right? You're only putting the best photos because you're self-presenting to other people. Furthermore, overly or too much concern with self-presentation can lead to certain health problems. So for instance, if you're too concerned about what other people are thinking about you, that could lead to certain problems. Here are just a few specific examples. So if you are embarrassed to buy condoms, for instance, because you're concerned about what the cashier at the drugstore will think about you, then that means people are more likely to engage in risky sex behaviors. If you're overly concerned about how you're coming across in terms of your skin tone, then maybe that's going to lead you to engage in a lot of sun tanning, which we know can be detrimental to your skin and increases your likelihood of developing skin cancer later on. Or if you're overly concerned about how you're coming across to your friends, and this is especially true in like junior high and high school things, then maybe you're less willing to say no to when they offer you drugs or something that you may not want to take. Right? Oops. So there are both positive and negative aspects associated with self-presentation. But we don't all self-present to the same extent. Even though we all kind of do it to some extent or another, some of us do it an awful lot, some of us only do it a little bit. And when we have a personality characteristic that varies from individual to individual, we call it an individual difference variable. And so self-presentation is one of these personality characteristics that we have that differs from person to person. Some people do it a lot, some people do it a little. And it varies according to a personality trait called self-monitoring. So self-monitoring is the personality trait that refers to the extent to which you self-present. Okay, so it refers to this tendency. Self-monitoring refers to this tendency to monitor the social situation to figure out how we should present ourselves within that situation. Because different situations have different self-presentation concerns. So as I mentioned, if you're on a job interview versus you're with your friends, there's different self-presentation concerns. You might want to come across as competent to the interviewer, but fun to your friends. And so someone who self-monitors a lot is picking up on those differences in those social situations and is consequently changing their behavior a lot depending on what situation they find themselves in. And a low self-monitor, in contrast, is doing the opposite. So a low self-monitor is someone who's not looking at the situation, who's not monitoring the situation, is not figuring out how they should behave in response to the situational demands. So what this means is that they're pretty consistent from situation to situation because they're not changing their behavior depending on the situation. Now, I should also say that whether you're a high or a low self-monitor is not a good thing or a bad thing inherently. There's good and bad things associated with each. So for instance, low self-monitor, on the plus side, they have a very consistent self. They're the same person in any situation, right? It's very consistent. That's a good thing, maybe. On the other hand, you could also argue they're not very flexible in terms of changing their behavior from situation to situation. A low self-monitor is someone that might go to a job interview and not really change who they are, and they act the same way in the job interview as they do around their friends, which is not necessarily a good thing if you're trying to get a job. So that's kind of the negative aspect. So it's got both positive and negatives to it. When I looked, I was thinking of examples from TV shows and movies of low self-monitors, and here are a few examples I came up with. So one, for any Seinfeld fans here, is Kramer from Seinfeld would be a low self-monitor. So if you watch the show, then you know that Kramer is kind of a goofball, and he acts the same way regardless of the situation he's in, and that's where a lot of the comedy of his character comes from, is that he's not changing his behavior depending on the situation that he's in, and it leads him to sort of behave in inappropriate ways. Similarly, Larry David, who is actually the guy who came up with the idea for Seinfeld and who has his own show, Curb Your Enthusiasm, on HBO, If you watch that show, you know that he's also a low self-monitor, and also a lot of the comedy from that show comes from the fact that he's not changing his behavior depending on the social situation, which leads him to get into a lot of sort of sticky situations, right? Or a lot of hot water depending on the situation that he's in. And I don't know if any of you have seen The Big Lebowski. It's kind of old, but it's also a cult classic. But the main character in the movie The Big Lebowski is the dude. This is the dude here. And when the dude is at home, this is how he dresses, kind of like this really ratty overcoat. And obviously he's got this long hair. He doesn't really care about his appearance in any way. And at the beginning of that movie, he goes to see the richest, most influential person in town. And he does this. He wears that, right? He wears the same thing. He's being the same person, regardless of whether he's at home alone or whether he's with the most powerful person in town, right? Because he's a low self-monitor. So in contrast, a high self-monitor is someone who is constantly monitoring the situation to figure out how they should behave and is constantly changing who they are depending on the situation. So, the pluses and minuses of a high self-monitor are just the opposite of what they were for a low self-monitor. So on the plus side, a high self-monitor is fairly flexible and adaptable and changes their behavior depending on the situation. On the minus side, you could argue maybe they don't have a very consistent sense of self because they're always changing who they are. Now, it's a lot harder, I think, to come across examples of high self-monitors from TV shows or movies. The examples I have, which probably should be updated, are a little bit on the older side, but if you're familiar with these movies, you might know what I'm talking about, but they are a little bit older. Adam Sandler's character from the movie Punch Drunk Love is a high self-monitor. If you watch that movie, what you notice is that he behaves a certain way at work and a certain way with his sister. And then when he goes on a date with a woman, he's very different. He's very awkward and very uncomfortable in that situation. And then when he's with other people in his family, he also gets really awkward and uncomfortable. And so he behaves very differently depending on the situation that he's in. Another really good example from an older movie is Nicolas Cage's character from the movie Adaptation. And he plays kind of a socially awkward person. But when he's with a friend of his, a good friend of his, he's very comfortable. When he's with his brother, he's relatively comfortable. When he's an author. When he's with his literary agent, he gets all sort of nervous. Or when he goes on a date, he gets really nervous and acts a little differently. In fact, there's a whole scene in that movie where you're basically inside his head and you're hearing his thoughts as he's at dinner with, I think it's his literary agent. And you can hear him think things like, is she noticing this about me? How am I coming across? Should I behave differently? And that's basically exactly what a high self-monitor does, is they're always thinking about how they should be behaving within that given situation. If you want to know if you're a high or a low self-monitor, I've given a self-monitoring scale here. So on these two slides, there's 18 items. And if you want to figure this out, if you're a high or low self-monitor, all you have to do is go through each of the 18 items and answer true or false to each one. You can see that the items that are being presented have to do with how much you monitor the situation. And how much you just try to change your behavior, or how much you stay consistent. So I guess I put on a show to impress or entertain others, for instance, in different situations and with different people. I often act like very different persons. That's number 8. Okay, and same sort of things. So once you answer true or false to each of these 18 items, I've then given you a rubric to calculate your self-monitoring score. So you give yourself 1 point if you answer true to any of these items and then false to any of these items. So you can do that on your own time if you wish. And then you add up your points and the total is your self-monitoring score. But if I just told you that your self-monitoring score is 12, well, you don't know what to do with that, right? Why don't you know what to do with that? Because we learn about ourselves through a process of social comparison. You want to compare yourself to other people to figure out where you are in that scale in relation to other people. And who do you want to compare yourself with? Well, if you want to find out about yourself accurately, you want to compare yourself with similar other people. So for that reason, I gave you the average North American college score for self-monitoring. It's about 10 or 11. So if you have a score higher than that, then you're a relatively high self-monitor compared to most people. If you have a score lower than that, you're a relatively low self-monitor. Okay, so just to summarize the section on the self, something that, again, I've mentioned this before and I'm mentioning it multiple times because this is a really, really important underlying motivational driver of human behavior, is that we tend to have really inflated views of ourselves, and we really like to have those inflated views. And we will engage in many psychological strategies in order to maintain these oftentimes unjustifiably high views of ourselves. And so we looked at a lot of what those strategies were prior to the first exam. And when those views are challenged in particular, we also have strategies to try to maintain and to reclaim those positive views. And so there's a lot of ways in which we sort of lie to ourselves or delude ourselves in order to convince ourselves we're really better than we are, because we really like that feeling of high self-esteem. Okay, so that's a theme. So if you want to understand a lot of social psychological behavior, then you need to understand these fundamental motivations. And so that one motivation, the idea that we like to think of ourselves really highly, we're going to see is a basis for a lot of other psychological behavior that we'll talk about later on. Okay, but we're switching topics now. So what we're going to be talking about for the next couple of classes is a subfield of social psychology that grew out of social psychology in the 1970s, something called social cognition. And social cognition is really the marriage of social psychology and cognitive psychology. So in the 1970s, a lot of methods were being developed within cognitive psychology to study how people think. And so social psychologists took a lot of those methods and applied them within a social context. And that created the field of social cognition. Now, what we're going to do is that for today's class and into next class, we're going to focus on the cognitive aspect. We're going to look at how people think and the ways in which our thinking gets messed up, the ways in which we reach inappropriate or just simply wrong conclusions from data because we systematically make errors in our thinking. And then starting probably late next class or into the following class, we're going to apply that to a social context. So we're going to see how we make mistakes in the way that we think about other people. But before we get there, we're going to focus on the cognitive aspect of things. And we're going to study how we screw up. And by understanding some of the biases that we're going to talk about in today's lecture and in Thursday's lecture, we're going to see the ways in which we reach inappropriate conclusions. And by understanding why we make those errors, why we engage in those biases, the idea is hopefully you can avoid making those mistakes in the future when you're thinking about things. You can come to better conclusions and make better decisions as a consequence. Okay, by cognition, we mean any cognitive process. That could be how we interpret information, how we analyze information, how we remember information, how we use information, et cetera, et cetera. And specifically, we're going to apply it to the social world. But again, we're going to wait to get there. We're going to focus just on the cognitive aspect at the beginning. Because as I've alluded, what we think we know to be true isn't always the case. Because a lot of the cognitive processes that we used to reach the conclusions, to come to the beliefs that we have, those cognitive processes were often corrupted in some way or biased in some way, which systematically led us to wrong conclusions, as we're going to see. But before we get there, I have two games I want to play with you. First game is really, really simple. Okay. What I'm going to do is in a moment, I'm going to put three numbers on the screen. And there's a rule that dictates those numbers. Okay. There's going to be a rule that determines which numbers can come next in the sequence. Now, the rule I have in this first problem is very, very simple. I'm not trying to trick you. It's not going to be like the number is the prior number plus the square root of 3 times the second number. It's nothing like that. It's going to be an incredibly, incredibly simple rule. I'm not trying to trick you in any way. Okay. So in a moment, I'm going to give you these three numbers that conform to that rule. And you've got to figure out what the rule is. Now, there's one catch. The only way that you can figure out what the rule is you can give me three numbers, and I will tell you either, yes, those numbers conform to that rule, or no, the numbers do not conform to that rule. And I'll do this a few times, and then at the end of maybe 3 or 4 people giving me numbers, I will ask you for what the rule actually is. Okay, and as I said, again, there's nothing tricky. It's a very, very, very basic, simple rule. So let's try this out. Let's see how this works. So the numbers I have are 2, 4, 6. And now in the chat, what I want you to do is type in 3 numbers, and I will say, yes, it conforms to the rule, or no, it does not conform to the rule. 8, 10, 12. Yes, That conforms to the rule. Wow, 3 people had A, 10, 12. Okay. Yes, that does conform to the rule. 12, 20, 46. Yes, that conforms to the rule as well. And I have a feeling that's going to change some people's ideas about what the rule is. 6, 22, 86. Yes, that conforms to the rule as well. 10, 14. Yes, that conforms to the rule. 100, 254. No, that does not conform to the rule. And I'm glad you said that. And we're going to come back and we're going to see why I'm glad you said that in a second. Okay, so does anyone know what my rule is? Feel free to type in the chat if you think you know what the rule is. 4, 16, 36, yes. 4, 44, 8, no. You guys figured it out yet? Does anyone want to take a shot at what the rule is? Increasing even number? Oh, you're so close. Any 3 numbers in increasing order. I didn't even think about increasing even numbers, but you're right. I think all the examples people gave were even numbers, right? Okay, so that's interesting. So we're going to come back to this because what you guys just exemplified is a very classic way of thinking about this problem, which systematically leads people to the wrong answer. And we're going to see this. I'm going to come back to this and I'm going to explain this in just a minute. I've got a second game though I want to play. This one's harder. Okay. I want you to imagine that I've got 4 cards. These are the 4 cards. Now there's 2 faces, right? One on each side. And you can only see one face of the card. So you can see that there's a card with an A on it, a card with a D on it, a card with a 3, card with an 8. Now, all you know is that on every card, there's a letter on one side and a number on the other. You know that that's true. However, what you don't know is whether the following rule governs these cards. So in other words, imagine the following rule. If a card has a vowel on one side, it must have an odd number on the other. Let's say that's a rule that applies to certain packs of cards and not others. And you don't know whether the pack of cards you have conforms to that rule or not. Okay? So the question then is, if you want to figure out if it conforms to that rule or not, which of these cards do you need to turn over to figure that out? And the correct answer could be none of them, could be one of them, could be 2 of them, 3 of them, all 4 of them. My question to you is, which do you have to flip over to figure out if it conforms to the rules? Let's get some answers from people in the chat. So I see 3, A and 3. Okay, those are the 2 most common answers, 3 and A and 3. Okay, I got another one, D, okay. I'll give you a few seconds if other people want to try to give me an answer. If you think you're right, get on the record now. Okay, so we've gotten 5 or 6 different answers so far. I'm going to give you a hint, and that hint is that no one has the right answer yet. However, I will say that what seems to be the most common answer that people are giving me is the most common answer that everyone gives when you ask this question. No one's got it. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. There's a rule in this class, basically, that if I tell you what the most common answer is, it's almost always the wrong answer. Okay. The most common answer that people give is A and 3. And that's pretty much what happened here, I think. Just A or A and 3, I think, were 2 of the most common answers. Okay. The correct answer, which no one got, is A and 8. Now, I'm going to walk you through this problem so you can see why this is the correct answer. But really the point of this exercise is to look at the cognitive process that you use to try to figure out what the answer is. And why is it that people systematically are led to the wrong answer in this? So let's take a look. So the rule says if a card has a vowel on one side, it must have an odd number on the other. Most people figure out you do have to turn over the A card, right? Because if you flip over the A card and there's an even number, 4, on the other side, well, then it couldn't have come from the pack that had this rule, right? It breaks the rule. If it has an odd number, 5, then it could still come from the pack. So you need to know what's on the other side of that A card, okay? Most people do figure that out. Okay, let's look at the D card. Does it matter what's on the other side of the D card? Well, it actually doesn't. because there's nothing in the rule that specifies that if there's a consonant on one side of the card, what has to be on the other side. So if you flip over the D card and there's a 2 on the other side, an even number, well, that's fine. It's consistent with the rule. It doesn't break any rules. If there's an odd number, if you flip it over and there's a 7, that's fine. That's consistent with the rule. There's nothing you can flip over that would break the rule, right? So it doesn't matter. You don't need to flip over the D card. All right, let's look at the first tricky one, because people think you have to flip over the 3 card, but it turns out you don't. The rule says if a card has a vowel on one side, it must have an odd number on the other. And people mistakenly think that that means if it has an odd number on one side, it has to have a vowel on the other side, but it doesn't. Let's imagine that you flip this over and it was a B on the other side, right? So it's a consonant, okay? Does that break the rule? Well, no, because the rule says nothing about consonants. It only says, the only rule is that if there's a vowel on one side, it has to have an odd number on the other. But if you have a B on one side and an odd number on the other, that's fine. It doesn't break the rule, right? If, on the other hand, you flip it over and it's a vowel, well, now it has a vowel on one side and it has an odd number on the other, an I and a 3, let's say. That's consistent with the rule. So there's nothing you can find. There's no letter that you could flip over that would break the rule. Because of that, it doesn't matter what letter's on the other side. You don't even need to flip it over. Anything works. But the card that people have a real hard time figuring out you need to flip over is the 8. Let's imagine you flip over the 8 and let's say that there's an E on the other side. That's a vowel, right? Well, if a card has a vowel, it must have an odd number on the other side. Well, that would break the rule if there's an E, right? That would definitely break the rule. If you flip it over and there's an F, that's a consonant. Well, again, the rule says nothing about consonants. It doesn't matter if there's an F. So you need to know if there is a vowel on the other side of that card or not. Okay, so that's why A and 8 is the correct answer. If you did not get that question right, and it looks like no one did, don't worry. Almost no one gets this right. Something like, it's less than 10% of people that get this question right. Almost everyone gets it wrong, and for similar reasons. Okay, so the reason I'm bringing these 2 games up that I just showed you is because people oftentimes, usually, come to the wrong answer in both of those games, but they come to the wrong answer for the same reason. And that's due to a bias known as the confirmation bias. Let me explain just briefly what it is, and then we'll go back and look at how it applies to these games. The confirmation bias is a tendency we all have. It is a ubiquitous tendency. You will see this everywhere. Everywhere you look, people engage in the confirmation bias all the time. Okay? It's this tendency that we have to look only for information that confirms what we already believe. So if we think about this in terms of, let's say, politics, for instance, what it means is that Democrats tend to look only for information that supports their political beliefs and to ignore other information. And Republicans tend to look only for information that supports their beliefs and to ignore other information. We like information that supports what we already believe. Why? Well, in part because, remember this theme, we like to think highly of ourselves. Well, if I can convince myself that my beliefs are correct, I'm a good decision maker. I can think I'm really good about myself. If I have to expose myself to beliefs that are contradictory to what I believe, and I might have to change my opinion, and that means I was wrong, well, that doesn't make me feel good about myself, right? So partly because of this tendency to want to think really highly of myself, I only expose myself to information that I already agree with. Okay, but let's look at how this applies to the 2 games that you guys just did. Okay, let's back up here. So let's look at this first game. Okay, so I've got 3 numbers, 2, 4, 6. And if you are like most people, your initial hypothesis was, well, these look like numbers increasing by 2, 2, 4, 6, right? And so when I give you the opportunity to give me a sequence of numbers, and I will say, yes, it conforms to the rule, or no, it doesn't, your bias is to try to give me numbers that you think are consistent with your hypothesis. You're looking for information that confirms your hypothesis. So the first 5 people all give me the same one, 8, 10, 12, right? 8, 10, 12 is an example of you trying to confirm your hypothesis. You could just as easily have given me 12, 10, 8 in an attempt to disconfirm your belief, but almost no one does that, right? Because that would require you to be deliberately trying to prove yourself wrong, which we are not good at because of the confirmation bias. Because of that, what tends to happen is people often come to the wrong answer. What will often happen is a couple things happen when I give this in class. Sometimes people will just give me a whole bunch of numbers and they're always increasing by 2. 8, 10, 12, yes. 16, 18, 20, yes. 468, yes. And then they get really confident. These are numbers increasing by 2, and they're completely wrong. And the reason they came to the wrong answer is because they didn't try to disconfirm their rule. Had they tried to disconfirm their rule, they could have come to a better answer, right? But that's not how we tend to think about things. Now, there were some people who seemingly did try to disconfirm that rule of numbers increasing by 2. So if someone gave me 12, 20, 46, 6, 22, 86, 10, 14, 18, that's good. What that is indicating is you were trying to disconfirm the initial hypothesis that you had. Unfortunately, it still led you to the wrong answer because you didn't try to disconfirm it enough. Because there's still numbers increasing, or any 3 numbers in increasing order, and people mistakenly believed that it had to be even numbers when they didn't. So what you had to do again is try to disprove your hypothesis that it had to be even numbers. The whole point here is that people systematically come to the wrong conclusion because of confirmation biases, that they don't try to disprove their beliefs. And that happens all the time. We don't like to disprove our beliefs, so we try to avoid it. That's effectively the same reason why people get the wrong answer in with this game as well. Because they read, if a card has a vowel on one side, it must have an odd number on the other. And your natural inclination is to therefore think that if there's an odd number, there has to be a vowel on the other side of this thing. And so you want to flip it over to confirm that belief that there's a vowel, right? What you don't realize is that in order to know if these cards are governed by this rule, you've got to deliberately try to disconfirm the rule by flipping over the number 8, by flipping over the card that has an even number. You have to recognize that if there's a vowel on the other side, that would disconfirm your rule. But because we're so bad at disconfirming our beliefs, that's not how we normally think about things. Almost no one realizes you've got to flip over this 8 card. Okay. Now, these 2 games are pretty highly contrived, right? They don't really have a whole, they're not really analogous to anything in real life. So it's easy to maybe think at this point that the confirmation bias is just something that applies in these very specialized situations. It doesn't really matter in the real world, right? But that's completely wrong. These games highlight how the confirmation bias can lead us to incorrect answers in these specific, highly specialized games. But the phenomenon is much more general than that. I kind of alluded already to this idea that politics, for instance, guides how we look for information. And so if you're a Republican, you're more likely to watch Fox News, for instance, which tends to lean Republican, because that gives you information that supports your preconceptions. And if you're a Democrat, you tend to be more likely to watch something like MSNBC, which tends to lean to the left to confirm your preconceptions. I'll give you some other examples and how they might be applicable to real life situations as well. This is a study that was done over 40 years ago. What these researchers did is they told participants that they were going to be interviewing another person that they had never met before. And the interview process was just going to be them picking a few questions from a list of questions that the researchers had prepared. And so among this list of questions are things like, tell me what you'd like to do when you're by yourself. Okay? Or tell me what you would do to liven up a party. So the participants, prior to interviewing this person, are told one of 2 things. They're told either that the person they're interviewing is very introverted, kind of shy, not very outgoing, not very talkative, right? Or they're extroverted, very outgoing. Now, in fact, what the researchers are doing, they're just making this up. They're just randomly assigning participants to be told one of these 2 things. This has nothing to do with the person they're actually interviewing. They're just randomly told this. Okay? But now what happens is that the interviewer has this false belief about the person they're interviewing. They mistakenly believe they're either introverted or extroverted. They're then able to pick these interview questions from a list. And what the researchers want to know is what questions would these participants pick? And would their choice of questions be biased by the false belief that they have about this person? And that is, in fact, exactly what they showed, is that if you were a participant and you believed the person you were interviewing was shy and introverted, you tended to ask them questions that led to an answer that would confirm that belief that they're shy. So you tended to ask them questions like, what do you like to do when you're by yourself? And maybe the person says, well, I like to read when I'm by myself. And that confirms your belief, that really is a shy person, right? On the other hand, if you believe the person you're interviewing was extroverted and outgoing, You tend to ask them questions like, what would you do to liven up a party? Well, I'd start dancing and, okay, well, if they start dancing, that confirms your belief that they're extroverted. So what happened here is that the interviewers were specifically trying to confirm what they already believed about that person. The problem is that even the most extroverted person can come up with something that they like to do when they're by themselves. And even the most introverted person can come up with an answer to the question of what would you do to liven up a party. So what happens is that if you ask a question like, what do you like to do when you're by yourself? And the person says, I like to read. That actually doesn't give you any information about whether they're extroverted or introverted, because both introverted and extroverted people can both read. It doesn't really give you that information. But to the interviewer, it feels like they're confirming their belief. It confirms their belief that they're actually introverted. So what happens is that these interviewers come to completely wrong conclusions about the person they're interviewing because of the confirmation bias. And this is why in the first week of class, in that true false quiz that I gave you, one of the items on there was something like interviews lead to better hiring decisions. And the answer was false to that. And the reason it's false largely is due to this phenomenon. Because what happens is that an employer, when they look over a CV, look over a resume, and they bring someone into an interview, they've already formed an impression of who that person is. And when they get them in the interview, they ask them questions that just simply try to confirm that belief, right? Because of the confirmation bias, they're not really actually getting a whole lot of good, useful information from that interview. As a consequence, the interview doesn't really add anything. That's the reason, one of the reasons why interviews aren't really the best way of figuring out who you should hire. Okay, so this is a potential consequence of the hindsight bias. I'll give you another example though. Let me describe this before I put this up. So in a second study, which is done a few years after this one, what the researchers did is they told participants about a girl named Hannah. And Hannah was something like 9 or 10 or something like that. And they were told one of two things. So some participants were told that Hannah comes from a really well-off family. They had a lot of money. Her parents are white collar. The other half of the participants were told that Hannah doesn't come from that well-off a family, that they don't have a lot of money, her parents are more blue collar, et cetera. Okay, all participants then had to estimate what grade, based on the information we gave you, what grade do you think Hannah should be placed in? That's what we're gonna look at first. Okay, that's gonna be this left-hand column here. So what the researchers have done is they've manipulated people's expectations of Hannah's performance. So if they were told she comes from a family with a lot of money and her parents had like doctorate degrees and they were white collar, they believed that Hannah should be placed in a slightly higher grade than if they were given low expectations, where they were told her family didn't have a lot of money, her parents didn't have college degrees, et cetera. Okay, that's fine. There's nothing inherently irrational about this. You might believe if someone has more money, maybe they can afford to spend it on tutors for Hannah, so maybe Hannah would be a little bit smarter, placed in a higher grade. Okay. But there's another condition, and this is the key condition, because participants in the second condition, once they were told that Hannah comes from either a well-off family or a not so well-off family, once that was manipulated, so they had these either high or low expectations, they were then shown a video of Hannah answering a series of questions. Now, everybody saw the exact same video, regardless of what beliefs they'd been instilled, everyone saw the exact same video of Hannah answering a series of questions. And Hannah's performance on these questions was sort of mixed. So she got some easy questions wrong, but she got some really difficult questions right. So it's kind of ambiguous as to how intelligent Hannah was. But everyone saw the exact same video is the key. After watching that video, all of these participants are then asked, what grade do you think Hannah should be placed in based on that information? What happened is this. If people initially had these high expectations for Hannah, if they see that video, they get even higher, right? I mean, after all, Hannah got some difficult questions right. She got some easy questions wrong, doesn't matter. She got some difficult questions right, so she should be placed in a really high grade, right? On the other hand, participants who were given low expectations for Hannah, she doesn't come from a well-off family, they see the exact same video and they come to the exact opposite conclusion. Their expectations get even lower. I mean, after all, Hannah got some easy questions wrong. She got some difficult questions right. It doesn't matter. She got some easy questions wrong. That's what matters, right? In other words, what's happening here is people are coming to the exact opposite conclusions, even though they're seeing the exact same information in terms of the video about Hannah. The exact same information is leading to exact opposite conclusions, depending on their initial belief. And that's because these people are engaging in confirmation bias. If they have high expectations for Hannah, all they're noticing are the times she got questions right. That's what they're weighing in their evaluation. If they had low expectations for Hannah, they're only looking for the times she got questions wrong, and they're ignoring the ones she got right. So their expectations get even lower, right? So the same information leads to exact opposite conclusions depending on people's beliefs. In fact, this happens all the time. In fact, it's happening right now. So the second impeachment of Donald Trump is going on right now, right? Well, what's happening here is that everyone's going to see the same videos, and this is all about him fomenting insurrection at the Capitol thing. And there's a whole lot of videos of this, right? So everyone's going to be seeing videos of his speech before that happened, and they're going to see all the videos of the people storming the Capitol, that sort of thing. Everyone's seeing the exact same information. But what's going to happen? The Democrats and the Republicans are going to come to exact opposite conclusions about how they're interpreting that information, right? The Democrats are going to think he's guilty, and the Republicans are going to think he's not guilty, for the most part, some exceptions in there. And part of the reason for that, well, there's multiple reasons for that, but one of the reasons for that is basically exactly what happened in this Hannah study, that people are going to see the exact same information and come to exact opposite conclusions because of their pre-existing beliefs, which changes the way that they interpret that information, right? So we all have this tendency to do this. We all have this tendency for our pre-existing expectations to bias the way that we look for information, to bias the way that we interpret information. Okay. So confirmation bias is a big problem. It can lead people to wrong conclusions all the time, and we're all susceptible to it. It is virtually impossible for us to put aside our pre-existing beliefs and be objective when evaluating something. Even when we feel like we're being objective, we're not always being objective. We're inherently biased by our pre-existing beliefs. That's a big problem. A second bias that people engage in, which is related to the confirmation bias, is something known as belief perseverance. Oh, by the way, and if I just go back to this here, this is partly why you might have had an experience where, let's say you're arguing with someone, maybe it's someone in your family or a friend or whoever, about something, about some topic, right? And it can be sort of frustrating because even though you feel like you're presenting them with objective data about why they should believe what you believe, they're completely dismissing it or they're completely interpreting it in a different way. And it can be frustrating and it feels to you as if they're being really stubborn and not being very objective. But you can rest assured they're thinking the exact same thing about you. They're thinking that you're the one that's not being objective because you're both being biased by your pre-existing beliefs. And so that's why people always think it's other people that are biased. People always think they're being objective and it's other people that are biased. In fact, we're all biased by this stuff. Okay, going back to belief perseverance. So belief perseverance refers to a tendency that we have, that once we have a belief and we've thought about that belief, if the reason for why we had that belief in the first place is completely discredited, meaning we should probably abandon that belief, we still tend to cling on to it. We cling on to our beliefs even after they've been discredited, is the idea. Let me describe a study so you can see how this works. So in this study, participants were told one of two things. They were randomly assigned to one of two conditions. So if you're randomly assigned to the first condition, so let's imagine that I'm the researcher, right? So I tell you the following. So what studies have shown over and over, we know this from like dozens of studies, is that people who are willing to take risks, risk takers, make better firefighters than people who are cautious. Okay. Now, what I want you to do is spend the next 10 minutes coming up with a list of reasons why that might be the case to explain that effect. Okay. So that's what I tell half of you. The other half of you, I say the following. So what research has shown, and we have dozens of studies to support this, is that people who are more cautious, who think a lot more before making decisions, they make better firefighters than people who are risk takers. And I want you to think for 10 minutes and come up with reasons why that might be true. Okay? So what I've basically done is I've instilled one of two beliefs in you. Either risky people make better firefighters or cautious people make better firefighters. After you've thought about reasons why that might be the case, I come back to you and I say, okay, you know what? What I told you before at the beginning about these dozens of studies, I made that up. There's actually no studies. We actually have no idea whatsoever whether it's risky people or cautious people who make better firefighters. We have no clue. But let me ask you, what do you think? Do you think it's risky people or do you think it's cautious people who make better firefighters? Now, what happens? Well, if you were initially a participant who was initially told that risky people make better firefighters, and then I come back and say there's no data on that whatsoever, you still cling to that belief. You still now think risky people make better firefighters, even though I've discredited the reason for that belief. And if you are one of these people I initially told that cautious people make better firefighters, and I tell you I made that up, you now still believe cautious people make better firefighters, even though I've completely discredited the reason for that belief. That's belief perseverance. Our beliefs persevere, they last, they outlast, or they last even though the reason for them has been discredited. But why does that happen? I mean, why is it that we still cling on to these beliefs? Okay, well, what's happened is that I gave you 10 minutes to come up with reasons for why that belief is true, right? So let's say I told you that risky people make better firefighters, and you spend 10 minutes coming up with reasons why that's the case. Well, you know, if you're a firefighter, you've got to just like run into burning buildings and save people. You can't like wait to do this long mental calculus to figure out if you should go in. By that time, the house is burned down, people are dead. You've got to just go in there, right? So risky people obviously make better firefighters. Maybe that's a reason that you came up with. When I come back to you later and I say, look, we have no studies on whether it's risky or cautious people who make better firefighters, I might have discredited the initial reason for that belief. But in the meantime, you've come up with your own reasons why that belief is true, because risky people have to run into burning houses, right? And I haven't discredited the reasons you've come up with. So because of that, because I've only discredited the original reason, but not the reasons you've self-generated, that's why you cling to that belief. Similarly, if you think cautious people make better firefighters, and I've given you 10 minutes to think about reasons why, you think things like, well, in order to know if you can go into that house, you've got to figure out if you're going to die. Because if you're going to die, then everyone else in the house is going to die as well. So you've got to like really be cautious before you just start running into burning buildings. And so when I later come back and discredit the initial reason for that belief, you've still self-generated a whole bunch of reasons on your own for why that belief is true. So you still tend to cling to it. So this is partly the reason for why our beliefs persevere, why we engage in belief perseverance. What this means is that we can eliminate belief perseverance, and studies have shown this. You can eliminate people's tendency to stubbornly cling on to their beliefs by having them consider ahead of time why their beliefs might be true or why they might be false. So for instance, if I told you risky people make better firefighters, that's what studies have shown. Now, I want you to take 10 minutes and think of why that might be true and also reasons why that might be false. Well, now you're coming up with a more balanced list, right? So when I later come in and say, we don't know if risky people make better firefighters, well, now you've got like 3 reasons why risky people are better and 3 reasons why cautious people are better. That's a more balanced list. You're now not necessarily going to cling to this belief that risky people make better firefighters. And hopefully you can see a relationship between belief perseverance and the confirmation bias. Because what happens is that when you have a belief that something is true, because of confirmation biases, you only start looking for reasons why that thing is true. So that later, when the original reason for that belief is discredited, you've only come up with reasons why that belief is true, and therefore you're more likely to cling to it. You're more likely to engage in belief perseverance. So part of the reason why belief perseverance occurs is because of confirmation biases. Okay, and again, you can see how if you've had arguments with people or you're discussing some issue with people, you can also see why you kind of reach the stalemate where it's kind of hard to convince them of your point of view, and they think the same thing about you. Because even though you feel like you're discrediting the foundational reason for their belief, they've been thinking about this for months or years if they've had this belief for that long. And they've come up with their own reasons why that belief is true. So even though you feel like you've demolished and discredited the foundation of their belief, they've developed their own reasons why it's true. And so they're more likely to cling to their beliefs. So these are a couple of reasons why it can kind of be hard to change people's minds about these things. One more bias I want to talk about is something known as a self-fulfilling prophecy. To explain a self-fulfilling prophecy, what I'm going to do is give you an example from outside of psychology And I'll give you an example from inside psychology. Okay. A self-fulfilling prophecy occurs when you have a false belief about something. You believe something that is wrong. And because you believe that thing is wrong, that makes that belief come true. Sounds sort of ironic, right? Or paradoxical. Let me give you an example. This is from outside psychology. So let's say that you got your money in a bank and you hear this rumor going around that this bank is about to go bankrupt. They're about to fail. They're about to lose all their money. Let's say that's not true at all. Let's say the bank is perfectly fine. They're making lots of money. They're not going bankrupt. So you have a false belief that the bank is going to lose all their money. Because of this, you rush to the bank and you withdraw all your money because you don't want to go bankrupt with your money in there, right? So you take all your money out, and so does everybody else. But the problem is because everyone's rushed to the bank and withdrew all their money, the bank has no more money and the bank fails. Now, that bank was not going to fail, except for the fact that you falsely believed it would fail. And that false belief actually led to its own fulfillment. It actually led the bank to fail. Now, that's outside psychology. So maybe we can use an example from inside psychology. So let's do this. Let's imagine that there is a new girl in the class. Her name is Sarah. You don't know anything about Sarah, but you've heard rumors from other people that she's kind of rude. So you have this belief that she's rude. Now, let's imagine that Sarah's not rude at all. Sarah's the sweetest girl possible. But you falsely believe that she's rude, okay? So you have that false belief. Because you have that false belief, well, when you pass her in the hallways, you're not going to say hi to her because she's a rude person. You don't want to be friends with a rude person. So you're not going to say hi to her when you pass her in the hallways, right? And after a few weeks of this, if you basically ignoring her every time you pass her in the hallways, she starts to realize that you're ignoring her. So what happens? Well, she's going to stop trying to say hi to you, right? She doesn't say hi to you. She's going to start ignoring you. And you're going to say, see, she's ignoring me. See, that proves that she's a rude person. But she wasn't rude. What happened is that your false belief that she was rude led you to behave rudely towards her, which she picked up on, which led her to behave rudely towards you. She wasn't inherently rude. She was just responding to your false belief that she was rude. That's an example of a self-fulfilling prophecy where the false belief led to its own fulfillment. Now you can see I have these numbered, this process numbered, 1, 2, 3, right? That's because on the next slide, which I'll go to right now, this lays out in a more general sense 3 steps to a self-fulfilling prophecy, which correspond on the previous slide to the numbers 1, 2, and 3. So in any self-fulfilling prophecy, there are always, always, always 3 steps. Okay, the first step is that a perceiver, so a person, develops a false belief about a target, about someone else. Okay? So that could be that you falsely believe this bank is going to go bankrupt, or in the example I just gave, you falsely believe that Sarah is rude. Okay? That's the first step to a self-fulfilling prophecy. The second step to a self-fulfilling prophecy is that the perceiver, the person who has the false belief, treats the target in a manner consistent with that belief. So if I believe Sarah's rude, I act towards her in a way that presupposes that she's rude. If she's rude, I start ignoring her whenever I pass her in the hallways. And the third step to a self-fulfilling prophecy is that the target picks up on that treatment and responds in a way that confirms the originally false belief. So because I'm ignoring Sarah in the halls whenever I see her, she responds to that treatment. She responds to the fact that I'm ignoring her by ignoring me back, which leads me to believe that my initial belief was actually accurate. Okay. And what's sort of important here is that the person who has the false belief in the first place never realizes that the only reason that person or that their belief turned out to be true was because they had the false belief in the first place. In other words, if I mistakenly believe Sarah's rude and she starts acting rude towards me, I believe that my belief was correct all along, right? But it wasn't. I don't realize that the only reason she's rude is because I treated her differently. I played a role in getting her to behave that way, and I have no idea that I did so. And so therefore I conclude mistakenly that my initial belief was correct. Now, understanding self-fulfilling prophecies can be really important. I'll describe one study that looked at this and some of the implications of this. Basic idea here is that researchers went to a school. This is like a grade school. And they administered a test to all the students, which they told the teachers was a test on identifying what are known as bloomers. Bloomers are students who are expected to show a sudden burst of intelligence over the next academic year. And this test, they tell the teachers, is able to determine which students in the class are going to be bloomers. Now, in reality, there's no such thing as bloomers. There's no such test. It's all made up. What the researchers did is they randomly picked a few students from the class and just told the teachers, you know what, these are bloomers. In other words, the teachers had a false belief now. The teachers believed that little Susie over there was a bloomer and little Timmy was not a bloomer. That's their false belief. The researchers then come back at the end of the school year and they assess the kids' intelligence. And what they find is that the kids that they had earlier randomly picked to be so-called bloomers actually got smarter than the kids that they randomly picked to not be bloomers. So if you look at this, if you look at the percentage of bloomers versus other students who gain 10 IQ points, what you can see is that a lot more bloomers gain 10 IQ points than non-bloomers. And that pattern holds depending on if you want to look at how many students gain 20 IQ points or 30 IQ points, whatever. The main pattern, the main idea here is that these bloomers actually got smarter than the non-bloomers. But how's that possible? I mean, after all, the researchers randomly picked people in the classroom to be these so-called bloomers. So why did the bloomers actually get smarter? Well, what happened is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're a teacher and you're told Susie is a bloomer, well, every time Susie asks a question, you're going to make sure to answer that question. You're going to go in depth. Maybe you'll hold her back after class and you'll explain things in more depth because she has the mental ability to understand this, right? She'll spend a lot of time with Susie. Timmy, though, he's not a bloomer. When Timmy asks a question, it's not even worth answering. He's not going to understand it anyway. I'm definitely not going to keep him, hold him back after class to explain anything because he's not going to understand it. So I don't spend any time with Timmy. So because I'm spending much more time with Susie than I am with Timmy, what happens? Susie learns more than Timmy does. Not because she's inherently smarter, not because she's a bloomer and Timmy isn't, but because she was treated differently than Timmy was, based on this false belief. So the teacher has a false belief. The teacher acts in a manner consistent with that false belief. That's step 2. She spends time with Susie, not with Timmy. And then the target responds to that treatment in a manner that confirms that false belief. Susie actually gets smarter than Timmy. This has some really important implications because let's say that I believe that whenever I teach my undergraduate social psychology class, that, you know what, Hispanic students just don't get social psychology. They just don't get it. Let's say I believe that. And because I believe that, whenever a Hispanic student asks a question, I'm not going to answer that question. I'm not going to spend time with them. I'm not going to explain anything. They're not going to get it. But all the other students I'll spend time with. At the end of the year, lo and behold, what happens? All the Spanish students don't do as well, or the Hispanic students don't do as well as the non-Hispanic students. That leads me to believe, you know what, my belief is true. Of course, what happened here is my belief was not true. What happened here is I treated the Hispanic students differently than the non-Hispanic students, which confirmed my original false belief. You can see how this would be really problematic in a classroom, right? Because if you take a field that's historically had many more men in it, so if you take like sciences and engineering and math and fields like that, which are historically overrepresented with men. And if I'm an instructor, and I think that's because the men are inherently better at math than women, which is not true, obviously. But if I believe that, and therefore I treat the male students differently than the female students, in the end of the year, I see the male students did better than the female students, that confirms my false belief. And so this false belief I have, I feel like it's continually being validated year after year, when in fact, it's only because of these self-fulfilling prophecies. And as a consequence, what happens is that in these fields, if the men actually do better because they're being treated differently than the women, then that just maintains that sort of bias in that field. Right? So it's really, really critically important to understand how self-fulfilling prophecies can maintain these sorts of biases that already exist culturally or socially in that way I just described. Okay, our time is up. I guess there's nothing you guys need to do for next class. We are likely to have a top hat quiz. I can't guarantee it, but just make sure you come prepared for that. And I will see you guys then. Have a great night. Bye.